Hello dear viewers, support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it, and also make sure you comment your thought. Now let's start the video. Hello dear viewers community, I hope you are all doing well. Previously I missed some chapters between episode 73 and episode 74. Some of you recently pointed it out. I know uploading it now cannot change what has already happened, and we have come ahead, but I would still like to upload it for someone who would still like to listen to it. Let's start the story for today. Dorne 299-300 AC. A year in the life of Lord Bronn of Skyreach. 1 year ago. As he watched Tyrion and Aerion land in front of him, he found himself almost reluctant to tell him what he'd done. It had not been his fault, and he'd had no choice, but he knew that perhaps wouldn't make a difference. Bronn may be a lord now, but he was still who he had always been, and not someone who'd been born into lordship. Was that not bad enough? There was the fact that he wasn't even Dornish to take into consideration. A true Dornish lord doing what he'd done would not suffer the consequences for it. If anything, he might be fated because of it. Were he a prince, then they may even give him an epithet because of it, such as the one Oberyn got for killing the Younwood Lord. Though according to Nyma, her father hadn't actually killed the man. Bronn thanked the gods for Nyma had she not come along when she did. Then he'd be in even more trouble than he already was. Watching Tyrion climb down from Lygaryn's back and seeing him help Aerion do the same, he knew he had to step forward and get in front of this right away. Soon enough, others would tell their tales, and in those he had no doubt that he'd come out worse in their telling than he would in his own. He moved forward, and though Tyrion was looking his way, his attention was still more on his wife than on him. It was only when he saw his expression that Tyrion said something to Aerion, and then as Aerion escorted the princess to her chambers to change, Tyrion walked his way. "What happened?" Tyrion asked. "It wasn't my fault," Bronn replied. "What did you do?" Tyrion asked. "He had it coming," Bronn replied. "Had what coming?" "Who had it coming?" Tyrion asked irritably as they walked into the old palace. "I had no choice. It was him or me, and you know I'm always going to choose me," he said, trying to laugh it off. "Bronn, what the fuck did you do?" Tyrion asked a little more loudly as he stopped and looked at him. 1 day earlier, the lesson he delivered was harsh but fair, and he'd done exactly as Tyrion had told him to do. As he helped Sariandran Gargilin up from the ground, Bronn leaned in close and left the men in no doubt whose disfavor he'd earned. "My prince sends his regards. You'd do well to have him not seek to do so again," Bronn whispered as he smiled and held the man's hand. "Fuck your prince." Sariandran muttered, "Careful or the next lesson I deliver will be a far harsher one," Bronn said before letting his hand go and watching Sariandran fall to the ground. Bronn then moved over to his wife and accepted her kiss. His eyes and her own were on Nyma as she spoke to Aerion, and yet smiled at them both. Tyrion was speaking to Jenlin, though his eyes too were on him and his wife, Bronn smirking when he nodded at him. He looked forward to the feast that night and to the promises of the night to come. The looks on his wife's, her sister's, and Nyma's faces, all promising him a night he'd never forget. It wasn't always that they shared their bed together, and both Jenlin and Nyma had made it a game to only reward them as they called it, when he did something which pleased them. It was a game he very much enjoyed, and given the looks on their faces, it was one that he'd won this time. He was disappointed when Tyrion and Aerion took to the skies rather than stay and enjoy the feast, and he knew they'd not be back until the morrow. Tyrion had confided in him that there was nothing like the open sky, and laying in the desert afterward, Bronn wisely for once keeping his lips shut, and not japing that it was perhaps the cold night's breeze on his exposed arse, as he lay with his wife, that Tyrion truly enjoyed. Without Tyrion here to keep him entertained, the man's company and wit had become something he'd grown to enjoy, even when it annoyed him. Bronn found himself sitting with his wife, her sister, and Nyma, and paying closer attention to the room than he normally would. Lady Silva sat with her betrothed Sariandran, and Bronn could see the man was still stewing, and the lady's attempts to soothe his damaged ego were not working. He resisted the urge to raise his glass and offer the man a toast, though it was a hard thing for him to do. Eventually, the night came to a close, and his reward was even better than he'd imagined it would be. It was thirsty work though, and they very soon went through the wine he'd brought to his Aunt Jean's room. Being a lord, his first instinct was to send for a servant to bring them more. The truth be told, he could do with some air and a rest, and were he to lay here and wait for the wine to be brought, then he'd get neither. So he dressed quickly and moved out into the gardens to cut across to the kitchens and wine cellars to fetch it himself. At what point he knew he was being followed, he couldn't tell, only that he was, and he cursed the fact he only had a dirk with him. Fuck, he said softly, as his ears picked out. That it was 3 men at least, though he'd wager it was 4, and he was proved right, when the spear flashed in front of his eyes. How the fucker had missed him, he knew not, but Bronn didn't miss. As he ducked under the spear's shaft and stuck the dirk through the man's chin and out the top of his head. He caught the spear as it fell and thrust out with it, catching the second man in the chest, before spinning and using the point of the spear to cut another man's throat. The last man tried to run, but he didn't get far as Bronn threw the spear and caught him in the back before walking over, removing it, and then forcing it down through the back of the man's head. "Bronn?" he heard the voice call out worriedly, and he looked to see Neem standing there. The small shift she wore barely covering her, as she looked at him. "These fuckers attacked me," he said. And she nodded as she asked him, was he hurt? "No, I'm good. Who the fuck are they?" "Gorgulin men. I think that one is Sarah and Ron," Nye said, pointing to the first man he'd killed. "For fuck's sake," he said, knowing the trouble this would cost. The following day, he looked to Tyrion, who was shaking his head as he finished telling him the tale. Bronn finding himself unable to judge the look on the man's face. They'd made it to his solar, and he watched as Tyrion took a seat and poured them both some wine. Bronn drinking it down quickly, and then pouring himself another glass. "One night I leave you alone," Tyrion said with a snort. "It wasn't my fault," he said with a shrug of his shoulders, realizing that Tyrion wasn't as angry as he may very well have been. "Naim will confirm this?" Tyrion asked. "She will. It wasn't my intent." "Tyrion, the fucker came out of nowhere. Had I known it was him, I'd not even have ended him. Just hurt him a little," he said with a chuckle. "Lady Silva will be so wroth," Tyrion said, an odd smile on his face that Bronn didn't understand the reason for. "Tyrion? It seems my schemes cost the lady a chance at love. She'd sought another husband, and then because of me was forced to deny her heart and be wed to Sarah Andre. Someone else whose heart lay in another direction." Tyrion said with a laugh, "Life and love, don't let anyone ever tell you that both won't kick you in the arse if you fuck with them."
"You're not angry?"
he asked, sipping his wine as he looked at him. "I'm fucking furious, and Arian will be even more so. There will be a big show of things, and I expect you to be your most humble and apologetic self, and to thank the gods that you're in the service of a dragon rider, and that my wife is a romantic at heart." "Were she not?" he asked worriedly. "Oh, Bronn, were she not, then I'd at least give you leave to run," Tyrion said with a chuckle. Now, watching Tyrion in Aryan land had brought back the memories, and for some reason, he felt the need to play a jape on his prince before the day was done. A year ago, Bronn had stood and pled his case in front of the princess and prince consort of Dorne and all its lords and ladies. Nyman had then spoken, and though some weren't happy with what he'd done, there were far more that were, none more so than the two ladies, whose betrothals were changed immediately prior to his plea. Lady Silva and Sarah Andre's betrothal was immediately broken, and the knight was given leave to follow his heart and marry Lady Alanis, Vats, something that pleased both of them greatly. As for Lady Silva, Sarah Andre, man she'd broken her own betrothal to based on Tyrion's plots and schemes, was now once again to be her husband. Even for someone like him who wasn't a romantic at heart like the princess was, you'd need to be blind not to see how each of them had welcomed this news. He watched as Tyrion helped Arianne down from Lyderon's back, the chainmail armor the dragon now wore making it easier for him to do so. Neiman Jane moved quickly to Arianne's side, while Tyrion looked over at him and walked his way. Bronn did his best to make his expression look worried, and though he wasn't one who excelled at mummery, it seemed to have the desired effect, as Tyrion now glared at him. "What happened?" Tyrion asked, and Bronn had to bit the inside of his cheek to stop his laughter. "It wasn't my fault," Bronn replied.
"Bruin,"
Tyrion asked, his annoyance clear, and Bronn lost his battle and burst out in laughter. "Bronn? Gods, you're so fucking easy," Bronn said, laughing still. "Careful, Lygaron hasn't eaten today." Tyrion said, his voice chilling, and as Bronn looked at him, he was relieved to see the smirk on his prince's face. "Very fucking funny," he said, and both of them laughed as they entered the old palace. The Riverlands 300 AC. The Blackfish. If he'd thought that the settling in period would be quick and easy with no issues, then he'd been a fool. The first of the things he had needed to deal with had been at the welcoming feast he'd had thrown for Bran. He'd been happy with those who'd come, and it seemed whatever hard feelings there still remained over what Cat and Edmure had done hadn't been passed on to him and his grandnephew. It was hard enough to be a new lord and to deal with all that entailed without having to also deal with issues that weren't down to anything you had been a part of. At one point, Brynden had worried that his presence, rather than being a help to Bran, may actually be a hindrance, and that had been his one true fear all the way from King's Landing to Riverrun. He'd not been able to shake the idea that his name in the stain that was now carried by House Tully would see itself attached to Bran. Had he found it to be true, then he'd have sought someone else to serve as his regent, and perhaps have made his way to the Wall to live out the rest of his days. So when he found out that if anything his presence only helped Bran to settle and was welcomed by the other river lords, it was a huge weight off his mind. As was finding out the state of the keep and its treasury. For all her faults, Cat had left the keep in good standing, and though she'd taken much of their portable wealth, there was still more than enough. So he'd not need to take out a loan from anyone. In time they'd be almost to what they were before, and even though they'd lost some lands, the king had given them favorable tax rates. In a year or two, they'd perhaps be where Huster had always had them. They had a need to do something with their guards, and to restructure some things, but no one would go hungry, and his grandnephew would not go into debt. His first major problem was with some of Edmure's former friends. Lyman Goodbrook, Tristan Rhaegar, and Mark Piper had made it clear that they'd not forgiven the dragon for all he'd taken from them, and had not learned the lessons that had cost Edmure and Cat their lives. They'd not come out blatantly and asked him how he felt about Rhaenys Targaryen, nor had they spoken out loud their own feelings. Not that they had needed to, as Brenshin may not enjoy the games the High Lords and Knights played, but he knew them well enough. The three men were fools, but fools had brought down his house, and he would not allow them to bring down his grandnephew. "Jonos," he said, taking a seat after Bran had retired for the night. "Brynden. Young Bran, he seems a good lad." Jono said, and they drank their ale. "Aye, he is. He'll make a damn good lord," he said with a fond smile on his face. "I'm relieved to see you guide him, Brynden, as I know are Tydos and the others." Jono said, "You and Tydos have set aside your enmity," he asked. "We're kin by marriage, and one day my grandson will be Lord Paramount. We'll never truly be close, but we're amiable enough, and the man came to my aid when I needed it. It's hard to then turn around and think him an enemy after that," Jonas said, and Brynden caught Lyman Goodbrook look his way, noticing that Jonas did too. "That all the Riverlords thought such," he said softly, and Jonas smirked. "Huh. You speak of the three fools?" Jonas said. "You're aware of them?" he asked. "It's not me that they need to worry about, Brynden. They've attracted the attention of far more dangerous men than me." "The king?" he asked softly. "His master of whisperers," Jonos said, and Brynden nodded. They spoke on other things, Jonos asking him if he'd be taking Bran to visit the other lords. And was it true that the boy was betrothed to Myrcella Hill? Brynden chuckling to himself about that later that night. Any true worries he had about Bran not being accepted were removed if people were seeking his hand in the future. Given that the king saw Bran as his brother perhaps, he really shouldn't be so concerned anyway. But he'd failed his family once, and he'd not do so again, be it from those outside his house or from themselves. This time he'd intervene far earlier and far more emphatically than he had before. He was heading to his bed when he heard the commotion, Brynden running towards Hoster's room and seeing Utheride standing there with Bran and Summer. His grandnephew was holding a book in his hand, and the steward was looking at it eagerly, so much so that he didn't notice his arrival. "Uncle, look what Summer found," Bran said excitedly, and Brynden moved over to him to take the book from his hand. "It's Lord Hoster's journal, Sir Brynden, the one we couldn't find." Utheride said, and Brynden nodded. "Where was it?" he asked, and Bran pointed to the hole in the wall. "Right, to bed with you, Bran. You've to be up early on the morrow. We've much to do. I'll keep a hold of this. Now go. It's far too late for you to be awake." "As it is," he chided gently, and Bran nodded before he and Summer walked from the room. Brynden waited until they were both gone and out of earshot before he took a seat and opened the book. He asked Itharites to explain what had happened and how Bran had found something they could not. Hearing that it was the wolf that did so was not as shocking as it should be. Brynden had been around the direwolves enough to know they were not normal. They had an intelligence about them that was unnatural, and he'd heard his niece say to Bran that the wolves always know, whatever that meant. After dismissing Utherites, he began to read the journal, and though he'd only intended to glance through it, he ended up reading it all. It was light out by the time he'd finished, and he'd gone through so many different emotions during the night that he couldn't remember which ones he'd felt at which time. All he knew was he'd been angered so much by what he read that he'd almost wanted to tear the book in two. The thoughts of how different things could have been had Hoster done what it was he wished to do were now causing him a blinding headache. Would Edmure still be alive? Would his niece have corrupted his grandnephew and forced the king to take his head also? Why hadn't Hoster told him, or handed him the letter? What had Edmure done? Each thought had sent him to dark places, and he believed that if Edmure were still alive, then he'd be a kinslayer, because he'd kill him where he stood. He believed it now with all he was, that his nephew had at the very least played a part in Hoster's death, and at the worst he'd killed him. Had Hoster unnamed him, then Cat would have been Bran's regent, and things would have perhaps been much worse. As her hatred for the king was irrational, she'd have used her position as regent, and Bran would have suffered as she had. As for his brother, Brenton believed that Hoster had made one last attempt to speak to Edmure, one final effort to set him on the right path, and it had cost him his life. What was he to do? Should word get out of this, then their shame would be even more than it already was, and his first instinct was to throw the journal into the fire. Yet he knew he could not, and that if anything the words needed to be spoken aloud, perhaps they would show his brother in a far better light, and remove some of the stains from his name. As for Edmure, nothing would do that for his nephew, regardless of what further revelations were made. He tried not to laugh at the irony of things. Both Edmure and Cat had spent years worrying about Jon Snow usurping Robb, and in the end, his own nephew, and Cat's own brother, had usurped Bran. As he rose to his feet and heard the crick of his bones, he sighed. Perhaps this would remove the last shreds of loyalty that the three fools had to his nephew and set them on the right path. Perhaps not. By the end of this day, all the Riverlords would know the truth of Edmure, and he'd see a raven was sent to King's Landing, warning them about Mark, Tristan, and Reimagined. Their fates were in their hands, the gods' hands, and the hands of the dragon, and Brynden had washed his hands of them. King's Landing 300 AC. Rosalind. When she'd been called to the king's chambers, she'd been so very nervous. She knew what it was she wished for, but she'd never dare to ask for it, and had instead just hoped and prayed that it would be offered to her. The tales of Jaqen H'ghris and Margaery were ones she and the other women at the Twins had heard many times, and she'd felt that there was a good chance that she'd be rewarded for telling him the truth about his father's remains. Still, when he actually told her that not only would he see her wed, but that he'd see her wed to the man who'd caught her eye, she'd barely believed it. She'd spoken to Lady Jenna about what it was she hoped for. The lady at first reassuring her that while the king was angry and would punish her house, he was not without compassion, and he'd only seek retribution against those who were actually involved. So she'd written out her list and named all those she knew had played their part, and had then sat with Lady Jenna and discussed her future. I know his grace will seek to reward you for this, so I'll ask you what it is you wish for. Rosalind? Genna asked as they sat and drank tea. I want what all ladies wish for, my lady. A good match, and one that will ensure my future. It's what each of us at the Twins dream of, and despite my father's way of going about things, it was always to him that we looked to see it so, she said softly. Your father is and has been the biggest obstacle to all your matches. You're a fine lady, Rosalind, one that were you born in any other house or to any other father would be much sought after. However, Lord Walder goes about things the wrong way. He demands and pesters rather than requests, and he aims far too high. He sought my nephew's hand, did he not? Lady Genna said, looking at her. He did, my lady, she replied, not looking the woman in the eye. A prince of House Targaryen, and he sought a match with him. Even were my nephew, who the realm hath thought him to be, your father still aimed too high. Be sure not to make the same mistake as he did. Lady Jenna said, and Rosalind nodded. Now with that in mind, who is it that you have your eye on? There had been surprise when she told her, shock even. More of the latter, when she had informed her brothers of what she'd asked for. Both Perwyn and Olyvar had been aghast when she told them what their father had done, and yet, when she told them she wished to be wed to a northern lord's son, that was what had truly shocked them. Each of them had tried to talk her out of it, bringing up talk of the faith and the cold of the north, and even disparaging the man who'd taken her fancy. It hadn't been what she'd expected when she came to King's Landing. She hadn't sought to see the Small John fight in the melee, and to find herself aflutter, and yet it had happened, and he felt so very right to her. As she'd left the king's chambers after he'd granted her what she wished for, She had almost danced and then the waiting had commenced. She feared the small Jon was betrothed or that he'd not wish her hand, and that even the dowry and the coin the king gave her for herself wouldn't be enough. Years of almost being betrothed only to be rejected began to prey on her mind, and she felt herself grow more worried each and every day until the invitation came for her to meet Lord Umber. She made her way to the rooms they had taken in the large tavern, both of her brothers beside her, and as she entered it she felt her heart still at the look. The small Jon threw her way. The smile he wore was to her eyes a true one, and as she moved toward the table he and his father sat at, she swore she saw the Gritton smile too. It gave her a confidence that she feared she'd never have, as she took her seat, and as both her brothers took theirs. Lady Roslyn, Sir Perwyn, Olivar, I'm Lord Jon Umber, though most call me the Great Jon, and my son here, as you no doubt know, my lady, is known as the Small Jon. The Great Jon said. Lord Umber. Small Jon, her brother said, and Roslyn put her hand out, surprised by the gentle kiss that the Small Jon placed upon it. His Grace has made his feelings on this match very clear, and I find I've no desire to go against him. However, it's not I who's to be matched, but you, my lady, and my son. So if your brothers would join me for an ale, I'll leave you both to speak. Will not be far, the Gratian said as he moved from the table, and Perwyn and Olivar joined him. There was silence for a moment or two, and then both of them tried to speak at the same time. Roslyn giggling a little at it, and happy to see what she found to be a most pleasant smile on the Small Jon's face, as he bid her speak. "Aye, is it Jon or Small Jon you prefer?" she asked softly. "Small Jon, my lady, Roslyn," she said with a smile. "Roslyn," he said a moment later, "I know your lands are harsh, and I want you to know, I'm not as delicate as I look. I will adapt to them, and I believe we could be most happy together. However, if I don't please you or if you can find fault, then I'd not hold you to any agreement," she said determinedly, and she breathed out deeply, once she'd finished. "I had not thought to marry, Roslyn. I'll be truthful with you about that, and since it was put to me, I'll not lie and say I've not thought of a way to break the betrothal and seek a way out of it. I find myself most pleased I've curbed my most stupid of impulses," the Small Jon said, and she felt herself relax. For the next hour, they spoke, and by the end of it, when her brothers and the Gratian moved back to the table, she found herself wishing they were not there with them. Looking into the Small Jon's face, she could see that he too was feeling this way, and it pleased her greatly. They agreed to spend some time together, and when the Gratian suggested she come back to the north with them to see the land she'd one day be the lady of, she accepted eagerly. Her brothers far less so, but they too agreed to travel to Last Hearth with them. The chance of sailing on a pinnacle ship, perhaps a far bigger reason for that than any true desire to see the north. When they got back to the Red Keep, she, Perwyn, and Olivar were called to a meeting with Lady Genna, where they were told what had happened at the twins and what sentence the king had given their house. It was far lesser than she had feared, and the thoughts of the 6 men who'd been sentenced to the wall now being gone from the keep were ones that she welcomed. As was the news that despite the loss of the income from the bridge and the taking back of Prince Tyrion's toll to serve as her dowry, that was the extent of their punishment. Steffron would make a far better lord of the twins than her father. In time, perhaps, their house wouldn't be looked down on the same way, and the other women would be as lucky as she was in their matches. She hoped they would be. "Lady Roslyn Umber," she said softly, as she lay in her room later that day, and she closed her eyes to dreams of her betrothed and the life they'd share together. Ornhill 300 AC. Randil Tarley. All his life he'd supported the dragons, even when they'd been deposed and he'd been forced to tip his banner and bend his knee outside Storm's End. It had been done so reluctantly, so much had he been for House Targaryen, that for years their perceived end had fueled his hatred of Mace Tyrell. He knew quite well that people thought him prickly over Ashford, and in a way he was. It had been him who'd won the day after all. That, though, wasn't his biggest issue with the Tyrells. It was Mace's refusal to give them leave to ride to Rhaegar's side, and what it had ended up costing them that he hated the man for. Arden, his former maester, tried to fuel that hatred even further, and had the man being someone he respected, then his words would have perhaps had a bigger effect. Maesters, though, were to help run the keep and advise only when needed, and he'd not take the advice of a man who had never swung a sword in anger. He'd not mourn the man when his body had been found, and later when he found out the truth of what he and his order had tried to do from Sarah Richard. He had welcomed it. It had also, in a way, made him appreciate his useless oaf of a son a little bit. He's there to learn and to be a maester. Randall, but he's also someone we know we can trust. Should they ever look to the dragons with anything but loyalty in their heart, then it'll be men like your son that we can rely upon." Sir Richard said, "It's not the life of a lord's heir," he replied, dismissively. "Then it's as well he's not your heir anymore, is it not?" It was true. Samwell, being in Old Town at the Citadel, had given him leave to name Dickon publicly, and his second son was more what an heir should be. Knowing that his other son served a use and would help see the dragons thrive even allowed him to feel something he never had when he thought about him. Pride. That it also allowed for his mother and sisters to not worry about how he was doing, and to read the letters he would constantly send them, made his own life easier in that regard too. In some ways, Randyll was a very different man than he had been over the last few years. When he'd found out the truth about Jon Snow and had later seen him with Sir Arthur Dayne, it had come as a shock, and yet one that he welcomed. Despite the boy being thought of as a bastard, even he'd been impressed with his skills with a sword, and when he'd faced him and beaten him he'd have accepted it as being beaten by the better man. After the boy had revealed who he truly was, that was even more true, he thought with a smirk. Learning they were to march to war, and that they had the West, North, and even Dorne at their side, as well as dragons, had been one of the greatest days of his life. The thoughts of finally being in a position to see the stagging brought low were ones that were another man would have had him breaking into song. Yet the battle had been a disappointment, the war over before it began. Other than in the assault on the Red Keep that was led by the king himself, Randyll had seen little action, even though he'd taken a wound in the process. It left him unfulfilled, and as he'd laid in his bed, recovering, he'd felt no satisfaction other than in helping a dragon back to the throne. It was as he was recovering that the king had come to him and spoken to him privately. "Your Grace, forgive me for not rising," Randyll said as he lay in his bed. "There is nothing to forgive, my lord. It's good to see you well. I've been informed that you should recover fully from your wound," the king asked as he took a seat by his bed. "As have I, your grace," he said as the king motioned to the jug of water and after Randyll nodded, poured them both out a cup. "I wanted to thank you personally, my lord. I owe a debt to you and to those who took this keep with me." "There is no debt owed, your grace. It is us that owe you our fealty, and on my own behalf, I am most happy to give it to you," he said before sipping his water. "And I'm most grateful for it, Lord Tarley. Truly. Sir Richard tells me that despite our success you feel as if you could have done more," the king asked curiously. "I do, your grace. Don't get me wrong. I'm most pleased that once again House Targaryen has taken its throne, but you wish to test yourself in battle, and no doubt after hearing of the God's Eye and the Trident, you feel cheated somewhat," the king said, and Randyll nodded slightly. "May I confide in your something few, if any, know?" "Of course, your grace. I'd be honored for you to do so," Randyll said, sitting up a little straighter in his bed. "It pleases me that the battles fought went so smoothly, not just because I care for my allies, though I very much do, but because this is not the only fight there is to come, and to be completely truthful, not even the most important of them. Oh, don't get me wrong, my lord. Without one there can't be the other, and this one was needed for more reasons than simply the right of it. But one day, hopefully not too soon, the realm will find itself in a fight it must win. On that day, my lord, I hope to be able to call upon you, and I promise you on that day, it's a fight you shall have." He had said no more than that at the time, only bidding him to fully recover, and that in time Sir Richard would get in touch and he'd learn more. It had made him reconsider things about the War of the One True King, his part in it, and the glory he'd not found. When he'd returned to Horn Hill, it had made him drill his men just as fiercely as he had from the moment he'd learned the truth about Jaehaerys Targaryen. So when the letter came and the cart arrived with the dragon glass, he'd done as he was requested. Daily his men fought against each other, in a manner that for the life of him, he couldn't understand. They fought against others of his men who were ill-disciplined, and fought like savages, and Randyll wondered if it was the wildings the king had been planning to fight. Only to remember they'd already been let through to wall. He thought it was usses of some sort, the Dothraki perhaps, only they didn't practice against horses. Were that not enough to confuse him, then the weapons themselves would see that so. Arrowheads, spear tips, crude knives, and axes, all made out of a material that should be brittle, and was very much not. Where they had found it in such a manner, he knew not only that be it the axe, hammer, or sword, nothing castle forged would break something, that he knew it should. Other than using Heartsbane against it, the dragon glass was almost unbreakable and crude, though it was. On that he was thankful. Daily they drilled and all without answer until one day a visitor came calling to his hall. "My lord, Sir Richard Lonmouth is at our gates." A courteous captain of the guard said after he'd knocked at the door of his solar. "See him in and have him escorted to me. Morrow have some wine and refreshments brought for our guest," he said to his squire, and the boy ran off to do as he was bid. It didn't take long for Sir Richard to walk in, and as he had been since he'd learned he was alive, Randall was pleased to see the man. He was a good man, and true, and that the king had found a role for him on his small council was a good thing. After he'd greeted him and bid him take a seat, Marlowe arrived back with some wine and a plate of bread, cheese, and cold meats. Richard seeming grateful for all of them as he drank and ate before he spoke. "It's been a hard ride. This is much appreciated, Randall," Richard said, after a moment. "What brings you here, Richard?" "It's almost time. Randall, His Grace will be sending you a raven soon, calling you and your men to arms. You need to be ready when he does. Half your men, Randall. You'll be asked to bring half your men to Old Town, and from there they'll sail to the Wall," Richard said. "Wildings?" he asked, and Richard shook his head. "No dead men. Randall, men and beasts who'll fall only to fire. Dragon galls and dragon steel. Heartsbane will be your greatest friend in the battle to come," Richard said, and Randall got ready to snort. "Dead men. Surely this was a jape. His Grace will provide proof and show you what you're to face. Randall, make ready and say your goodbyes to your family and let the men say their own. The call is coming, and it'll be but weeks and not even a moon when it does so," Richard said. He smiled as he looked at him, the king's words proving true, and whether it was truly the dead or some other enemy he was facing, he cared not, only that the fight was coming, and that he would play his part, just like at Ashford. The Vale 300 AC, Lady Anya Wainwood. Men were so predictable. Her grandson had fallen for his betrothed the moment he'd seen how fair she was. Lady Lyanna bore the same beauty that all those of House Tyrell did, to varying degrees. Were you to look at the girl from a distance, and she to be dressed in her Grace's clothes, then you'd think it was the Queen herself you were looking at. Even close up there were times she could be her Grace's twin, so as soon as she'd smiled and Roland had kissed her hand, her grandson was smitten. Lyanna herself took a little longer and needed to spend time with Roland, before Anya began to see the signs that she was at least not against the match. And after a week or so at Iron Oaks, it was clear she was far more for it. Iron Oaks too pleased the lady, and knowing that she would one day be the lady of the keep, even more so. As for Anya herself, she found the girl to be a delight, smart, charming, and possessing of a keen wit. She was all she'd ever wished for in a good granddaughter. That the match itself was fortuitous only made her even more pleased. Yet despite all of that, it wasn't Roland and Lady Leona that had her feeling as she did now. It was Donal and the news she had to share with him, and had been keen to do so from the moment the Queen had informed her of it. Had it not been for Lady Leona and her brother Septileon wishing to visit Iron Oaks and meet with her betrothed, Anya cursing herself for not bringing Roland with her to King's Landing, then she and Morton would have traveled to speak to her second son by now. As it was, she had to wait until the lady and her brother had departed, and arrangements were made for Roland to travel to Highgarden and meet with Septileo, Lady Alice, and the rest of Leona's family. The same day that she said her goodbyes, and Lady Leona, her brother, their escort, and Roland made their way by boat to Gulltown, Anya had Morton form up their own guard, and they quickly began their own journey to the Bloody Gate. "Would not a letter suffice, mother?" Morton had said, and she'd glowered at him as she shook her head. "I'll not send word to your brother of his new role in a letter. I intend for us to travel to the Eyrie, and to take stock of all that's needed, once we reach it. To then scout the lands for the best place for a keep to be built as per her Grace's request," she said as Morton nodded. "Aye, perhaps you have the right of it." Donal would probably run from the Bloody Gate if he read it first, Morton said with a chuckle. The time it took them to travel to the Bloody Gate passed quickly. Anya found that her excitement with the reasoning for that journey somehow made the days just fly by. She even enjoyed camping out, which was not something she usually did. Sitting by the fire and eating freshly caught and cooked food, and listening to her son and their men speak, adding to her enjoyment rather than taking away from it. They'd brought a large party to ensure there was no trouble from the mountain tribes, and only had to fend off one attack along the way, the nature of which was something she'd still been thinking of when they reached the Bloody Gate. A large eagle had squawked loudly over their heads, and had forced the ambush to be foiled. Enya, unlike Morton, was still sure that the eagle had done so deliberately, and that it wasn't the gods who had been watching over them. Tales of what the king may be able to do with birds and other animals were ones much spoken about amongst the men of the Vale, and she found she believed them more truly now. "Mother, what are you doing here?" Donald asked when he saw her. "Morton and their escort." "Is that any way to greet the woman who brought you into the world?" she asked, smirking as she winked at young Sandor. "I'm always pleased to see you, Mother. You know that," Donald said as Morton helped her down from her horse. "As well you should be," she said, embracing her second son. "Now let's get me inside somewhere warm before I freeze my old bones more than they already are." She was happy to feel the fire warm her up and at the warm meal and hot cider that Donald had sent Sandor to fetch for them. Her guards, too, would be happy with being indoors, even if it was to be only for one night. Once she'd warmed herself up and eaten, she told Donald to take a seat and had then gone on to explain to him her reasons for being here. Her son's shock forcing him to be unable to respond to her for what felt like an age. "Why, Mother? Why would their graces wish to reward us so?" Donald asked, after a while. "Despite him deserving his fate, I feel their graces had no desire to see Harold fall. Were they how some had feared then, they'd have stripped him of land and title, right at the start of things. Even those who rose against them have been treated far more fairly than any of us had dared to hope. And as for us, there are many reasons. You, Donald, are but one of them," she said proudly. "I am?" he asked, confused. "This king knows things, Daniel. We all found that out during the War of the One True King. At each step, it was we that were in the dark, while those on his grace's side knew far more than we did. And his grace even more than them. I'd wager, I've no doubt, word has reached him of your part at the gate, of the things you said, and that I said. So we found favor with a good king and queen where once we had none with our own liege," she said, looking at her son. "I had thought this, the night of the bloody gate, this was the limits of my ambition," Donald said, looking to her and to Morton. "Well, no more is it to be. You are to be the Castellan to House Targaryen of the Vale, a future sworn bannerman of the head of said house. Sworn to them, and the crown above even Lord Royce," she said, and she saw how he swelled up in pride, something she herself had done ever since it had been told to her. The next day, they said their goodbyes to the bloody gate, Donald handing over his seal to his second, until Lord Royce sent the new knight to take his place. Their destination was the Eyrie, and as she rode with two of her sons, Anya found herself smiling when she saw the eagle flying over her head. It was a far more welcoming sight than the falcons, after all. Harrenhal 300 AC. Lady Shella went. Her time was nearly up. She felt it keenly, and in a way she welcomed it. She'd lived a good and long life, and had finally seen a dragon back on the throne, something she'd fear she'd not live to see. Her children were long past, and she was the last of her line, and where at once she would have feared what was to become to Harrenhal when she passed, she feared it no longer, the seat of a Targaryen prince or princess, her home to be honored in such a way, and her sigil to be incorporated into their own. As legacies go, it was not a bad one to leave behind. She knelt by the weirwood and spoke her prayers. They were not her gods and not Oswell's either, but they were the gods of the king. They both served. It was why she'd seen his bones buried beneath them, after the king had returned him to her. His words about the trees had stuck in her mind, and Shella smiled as she remembered them. The old gods watch the world through the weirwoods. Lady Shella, it's what the North believes, and I know they watch me through them. When I kneel and speak to them, offer them my prayers, my thanks, and talk about my fears, I now they can see and hear me. The king said, "Then perhaps you have the right of it. Your grace, and it's us who follow the seven in the wrong," she asked, as she looked at him. "No, my lady, anyone with faith has the right of it, whatever it is that they have faith in." The king reminded her of his father at times, even though she'd only spoken to them both on a couple of occasions. There was an earnestness about him, sometimes, that she remembered the prince having, and yet he was different from him too, and she wondered if that was his mother shining through. She struggled to her feet and coughed a little, her handkerchief going to her mouth, and she could see the blood that now stained it as she wiped her lips. "My lady, do you require help?" Maya asked, and Shella shook her head as she turned to look at the young woman. "Robert Baratheon's daughter, she may be, but she had none of his temperament, and none of his animosity against the dragons. If anything, Lady Maya Redfort may very well be one of the few people in the realm who thought of the king even more highly than she did." Shella had been surprised when she and her husband had arrived and told her their tale. The letter from the crown proving them true, just as much as their words did. They were to be sworn to the prince or princess of Harrenhal, and they were here to seek out the lands of their keep. In time they would see to its building, and they would serve in her stead as Castellan of Harrenhal should the need arise. Arise it would, and soon, she thought with a smirk as the lady took her arm, and they walked back toward the keep. They didn't make it far before she felt the shadow of their heads. Maya looking up in alarm when the white dragon flew over them. Shettle felt her heart race a little and looked back at the weirwood with a wry smile on her face. They didn't hurry through the godswood as she wasn't able for such a thing, but they did manage to reach the courtyard before the king, and she was most grateful for that. Harrenhal is yours, your grace, she said as she curtsied. Maya, Michael her own, and their guards, all kneeling beside her. A thank you for the welcome, my lady. Please rise, the king said, and she found how intently he looked at her to be a little off-putting. He greeted both Michael and Maya warmly, both of them pleased to see him, and then he asked if he could speak to her in private. They walked together to her solar, Ser Arthur behind the king, and once again she found the king looking at her intently. By the time they had taken their seats and refreshments had been brought, she found the looks disconcerting, and so she was pleased when he explained his reason for them. Forgive me, my bluntness, Lady Went, but I had not intended to stop off at Harrenhal on my way back to King's Landing. I would not have were it not for Rhaenix, the king said. Your dragon wished to stop here, your grace, she asked curiously. She did, my lady. My sister believes your time is short. Forgive me for putting it in such a way, he said, shaking his head. On that she has the right of it, your grace. My time is coming and is soon to be at an end, she said, and she was surprised to see the sadness in his expression as he looked back at her. It pains me to hear it, for true, my lady. No words I can offer will bring you respite, and so perhaps actions will have to suffice. Your grace, which of the towers can you see from your room, my lady, from your window? The king asked. The Tower of Ghosts, your grace, she said, looking at him curiously. It's unused and empty, my lady, the king asked, and she nodded. Very well, I'd ask you to look from your window, though. If you'd prefer, you can do so from the courtyard, whichever provides a better view. The window, your grace, she said, and the king rose. An hour later she stood at her window. Mayen, some servants, and Tothmore the maester beside her. The sound of the song filled the air, and then she and those with her were forced to turn their eyes away as a light began to shine that was brighter than any she'd ever seen before. Shella felt her excitement begin to rise as tales of what the king had done when he dealt with House Frey had reached her within days of it happening. Yet even she was amazed at the sight she saw when the light began to fade away. The Tower of Ghosts stood as if it had just been completed. Its black stone shone and sparkled almost. She hurried from the room, so eager was she to see it even more truly, and as she reached the courtyard she saw the king standing with Sir Michael and Sir Arthur. When he saw her, the king moved towards her and offered her his arm, which she happily took. Around the courtyard she could see the looks he was receiving, and though she couldn't hear the words that Michael was saying to Michael, as she could hear the wonder in his voice as he spoke. By the seven, she said, gasping, as she looked at what had once been a ruined septon, the stone again looking as if it had just been built. Entering the Tower of Ghosts was like walking into a different world than the one she'd known at Harrenhal all her life. It felt as new as it looked, and though the wood and glass needed to be repaired, the stone itself did not. There was no evidence of what Baelian had done all those years ago. And, for the first time in her life, one tower at least was how it should be. Shella listened as the king explained that, in time, the entire keep would be this way, and that had he been aware of her health, then he'd have seen it so by now. I thank you for showing me this much, your grace, she said above his protests. And he nodded when she made it clear that he'd given her more than enough. He stayed at Harrenhal that night and refused to leave her bedside when she felt it come upon her. The king himself opening the window so she could look out on the Tower of Ghosts as night began to fall. When she reached out her hand, it was his own, she found, and he held it as her time drew to a close. Shella smiling when he began to sing a soft song to her and welcoming that it was Jenny of Old Songs that he chose. And she never wanted to leave. She never wanted to leave. The sound of his voice was comforting as she closed her eyes and breathed her last. Storm's End 300 AC. Sudavas Siworth. Each day he spent with Shireen was a day he enjoyed, and even more so now that Maria had come to stay at the keep with him. Dale, despite his wish to remain on the Wraith, had agreed to serve as Castellan at Cape Wrath. Davos knew that his good daughter was more than pleased with that, since it kept him on land with her and their babe. His first grandchild was a girl, and though Marya had wished to stay and spoil her, his duties would keep him at Storm's End for many years to come, and a keep was not a ship, which meant that she could join him there. He welcomed that, truth be told, as for far too many years he and his wife had seen each other only when he was not at sea, and though he loved the Black Betha, he'd missed far too much over the years. His boys were growing. Davin, Stannis, and Stefan needed their father, and they could be better educated at Storm's End than anywhere else. Shireen, though, she was the daughter of his heart, and the one he and Marya hadn't been blessed with. She was the light of his life in so many ways, and for Davos being by her side and helping her any way he could, watching her as she blossomed into the young lady she would one day become. There were the things he was most grateful for. His relationship with Lady Salas had changed over time, because of Shireen and the lady's newfound faith in the Red God. Salas still kept mainly to herself, but with him, she was polite and respectful. Now, where once there was only ever scorn. As for the other knights and lords of Shireen's family, they too had come to see him in a different light. None more so than Lord Renly, who was still some way from being the man he had once been, though that in of itself was not a bad thing. Between the Lord and Shireen herself, they'd managed to gain far more of the king and queen's favor, and so even more of their restrictions had been removed. Taxes had been lifted. They were brought more and more into trade, and in time, the Stormlands, diminished though it was under Shireen's rule, would be in a far better place in terms of coin and prosperity. At least, their relationship with their vassals was far better too. Shireen had a knack for seeing what even he could not, and knowing what a lord or lady truly desired. Never had this been more clear than with what she'd done for Lady Shira and Lord Sebastian. It made him look forward to what each new day would bring, yet he had never expected this day to bring what it did. "What do you mean there's a fucking dragon at the gates?" he asked Devon as he hurriedly dressed. "The king, father, the king is here," his son said, and Davos found his hand going to the pouch around his neck, worry in his features as he hurried from his and Marya's rooms. By the time he reached the gates, the dragon was flying over his head, and the king and Sir Arthur Dayne were walking in through them. Davos hurrying over to welcome them both, and wondering what it was that had brought them here. That it was only the two of them and the dragon was now out of sight, at least showed it to be a friendly visit. Though had it not been then, he'd have no idea why that would be the case. "Your Grace, we'd not expected," he said, stumbling over his words, while Devon looked at the king and the Sword of the Morning with an awestruck look on his face. "Forgive me, Sir Davos, my visit wasn't planned. I carry a letter from Lord Stannis to the Lady Shireen," the king said, and Davos nodded. As they walked to the courtyard, he could see people hurrying, and the king's frown, not at their tardiness, he was soon to find out, but that his arrival had caused such fuss. "I remember when I was able to just go somewhere and people, while polite, made little fuss. I find I long for those days," the king said, and Davos chuckled. "The curse of position, your grace," he said, getting a smile from the king. "Your boy, Sir Davos, forgive me, but while knowing the names of your sons, I don't know which is which," the king said, looking at Devon. "Devon, your grace," he said, as Devon looked from him to the king, and wondered why they were speaking about him. "Devon, could you do a task for me?" the king asked, and Devon nodded. Devon was sure his son couldn't speak if he tried to. "Could you let the Lady Shireen and anyone else who you come across know that a welcome isn't needed, and that I'd very much appreciate them continuing about their day? Could you do that for me, lad?" "Of course, your grace, at once, your grace," Devon said before running off once he'd nodded at him. The king's smile grew broader as he watched Devon run to do as he had bid, and by the time they reached the main hall, Shireen was sitting in her seat rather than having come outside to greet the king. Devon was standing with Stepton, and Stannis and Davos smiled to see his wife holding their youngest by the hand. "Storm's End is yours, your grace," Shireen said, as while protocol may have been altered at the king's request, it was not completely forgotten. "I thank you, my lady," the king said. "Please forgive me for the lack of forewarning, as my visit wasn't something I planned. If we may speak in private for a moment, then perhaps I can explain it far better." "Of course, your grace." "Sir Davos, could you show his grace to my solar?" Shireen said, and her voice sounded far more assured than the look on her face. Davos agreed to do as she asked, and he offered her a warm smile which he hoped showed that there was no need to be concerned about the king's surprise visit. It seemed to do the trick, as by the time they reached the solar, Shireen looked far more relaxed. The king turned down the offer of refreshments, although he and Ser Arthur both accepted some water. I came for 2 reasons, my lady. The first is to deliver this to you by mine own hand, as I promised your father I would. The king said, handing Shireen a letter. I thank you, your grace, Shireen said, her smile true, as she held the letter in her hands. The second, your grace, he asked, a moment later, when Shireen did not, is something I'm not certain of the proof of, and so I ask your indulgence. The ruby you wear, my lady, the one gifted by my aunt that protects against and hides the grayscale. I believe it's no longer required, and so I wonder if I can ask you to remove it. The king asked, and Shireen looked at him worriedly. Each time I've done so, the grayscale has returned. Your grace, Shireen said. I am not completely certain, but I believe this time it will not, and that you'll not need to wear the ruby anymore. May I? The king asked, reaching out to take it from Shireen's neck. Davos looked on as Shireen unclasped the chain and handed it to the king. The look of worry now even more pronounced in her face until she saw both his and the king's smile. As the king took the chain from her hand, her other hand reached up to touch her unblemished face, and soon she too was smiling. How? He asked. I found out the cause of grayscale while in Essos, Ser Davos. A curse placed upon a prince of the Rhine and his people. I've lifted that curse, and I believe the disease itself now no longer exists. The king said as Shireen looked at him. I'm cured? For true? She asked, and the king nodded. You are, and though this is worthless now for that, I find I may have a use for it, so by your leave, the king asked, holding the ruby and the chain. Of course, your grace. I thank you, truly, Shireen said. There is no need to do so, cousin. Though they offered to feast him, the king made it clear that he wished to be back in King's Landing with his wife and daughter, and so he bid them farewell and readied to leave the keep. He didn't make it all the way, though. As before, he reached the courtyard. He was asked if he would show them a spar. The request was made by 2 of his sons, and Davos almost pulled them aside, only to see the king smirk at Ser Arthur before agreeing to do so. He stood in the middle of the courtyard, with his wife and sons on one side of him, and Shireen speaking to her mother on the other. When the king pulled out Blackfire, Davos heard the intake of breath from all 3 of his sons, though it was even sharper one when Arthur pulled out Dawn. The spar took some time, the 2 swords flashing in the air and coming perilously close. He thought to injuring either the king or Ser Arthur. However, not one drop of blood was spilled, and eventually the king yielded, his smile beaming as he did so, and then looked to his sons, giving them a nod. Then, but a few moments later, he was gone. The white dragon now heading towards King's Landing, with the king and Ser Arthur on its back. Shireen sat on a wall, reading the letter he brought her from her father, and Davos saw her wipe a tear from her eye, more than once. When she was done, he walked over to her and found her mood to be a good one. The letter had been hard for her, though, and so he told her to take the day, which was sense she appreciated. The smile she gave him as she walked into the keep was one that he carried with him for the rest of the day. Later, as he'd finished his own duties for the night, he found he'd very much enjoyed what the day had brought, and he looked forward to the morrow. King's Landing, 300 AC. Jaehaerys Targaryen. He needed it. More than anything in the world he needed to be back in King's Landing, and with his wife and daughter. Even were it not for the certainty that he would not be with them, for as long as he wished, and that when next he left, it was to an uncertain fate. He needed it for other reasons too. As hard as the reality of the journey north had forced him to confront, it was the emotional toll the return had taken on him that he was feeling as they now flew over the Kingswood. After he'd left the wall and spoken to all those he'd needed to in the north, he'd intended to fly back to Marjorie and Elia, with no divergences. He would have spent some time with them before then flying to Storm's End, and handing Shireen the letter from her father, and Harrenhal was not in his mind. It was in Rhaenix's though, and he felt her own need and desire, and so it changed his destination completely. Jay was glad that it had, even if the events at Harrenhal had taken their toll on him. Lady Shella deserved some comfort in her final moments, and showing her some of what would be done to Harrenhal and then offering her the peace of a song was the least he could do, given all her family had done for his own. It had truly brought it home to him that while there had been houses, lords, ladies, and knights who'd sought to bring his family to their knees, there had been others who'd raised them up. It was something that Arthur had felt just as keenly as he had when they'd said their final goodbyes to Lady Shella and saw her buried beside Oswald in the shade of the great weirwood. After they'd done so, he'd felt the need to do something that at least would bring a smile to his face and a lightness to his heart. So it had been Storm's End and Shireen, and he'd been more than pleased to be proved right. Yet as comforting as it was not enough, and as he saw the Red Keep come into view, he bid Renix land there, rather than at the Dragon Pit. Go, spend time with Rhaegar, Sandorex and Elegon. Show them what it is they need to see, he said, leaning against her head after he'd climbed down from her back. We must teach them, Jay, not just show them. We must teach them too, she said, and he told her that they would, and then turned to see Sarah Richard and Sarah Brienne before he was soon enveloped in a warm embrace. It was one he needed, and he welcomed it, and the nodding of her head when he spoke to her. Joy only too keen to spend time with him, and though it wouldn't be today, there would be far more of it in the next moon than it had in the previous one. He told Arthur to go and get some rest, and carrying the sack which contained a crown that he may not have understood the true importance of. But he knew it was far more important than just its symbolism. He hurried to his chambers, that he barely spoke or acknowledged Loras and Thurston wasn't meant or seen as a slight, and hearing Margaery speaking to Ilya as he entered the room was all that he needed. See, I told you that your papa was back, little dragon, Margaery said as she walked over to him, with their daughter in her arms. Gods, I missed you both so much, he said, kissing each of them. Elia on the forehead and Margaery softly on the lips. It was only after he did so that he noticed that Ilaria and Elena were in the room. Jay greeting them both, and kissing Ilaria's cheek, when she raised her eyebrow at him, questioningly, that they then quickly left the room. He felt both guilty for, and yet very much not. For now, he just welcomed that he was now alone with his wife and daughter. Margaery handed him Eleo and they moved to their bedchamber and lay down on their bed. The two of them leaning upon their elbows to look at each other and at their daughter as he began to play with her. He was grateful that Margaery didn't ask him about his trip, even though it was clear she wished to. As he knew once he spoke of it that in some ways the peace he now felt would be shattered. Instead, she laughed as Ilya played with his fingers, as she bit and gripped them tightly, and as she laughed when he tickled her ever so gently. Margaery chided him when he began to drift off and made him take off his armor before he even thought about doing so. Though as soon as he did and lay back down on the bed, he was doing so again, and this time she let him fall to sleep. His dreams were welcoming, and he found himself watching on as his daughter flew on the indigo dragon, and as someone he believed to be his son flew on one of a vibrant blue. He felt his wife's arms around him, and he looked to the ground to see a young boy playing with a small scarlet dragon. The boy's dark gray eyes looking up at him happily as the small dragon chirped and flew to land on his shoulder. It was a dream that he would give anything to see come true, and he hoped it was a portent of the future to come. I'm up, he said, sitting up in the bed, and he looked around the room to see that night had fallen, and that he was alone. Rising to his feet, he walked out from the bedchamber and found his wife sitting on the couch, sewing something that looked to be clothing for Ilya. His daughter lay in her crib, and Ghost rested beside it. His wolf was wide awake and ever watchful. In the corner lay the indigo dragon, as it slept on some cushions, and he knew that soon it would be far too large for these rooms. He moved to where Margaery was and took a seat beside her, his wife kissing him this time, and he welcomed the feel of her lips on his own. Are you hungry? She asked, and he shook his head. Perhaps later. Have you eaten? He asked him, and she told him she had not, that she'd waited for him. I'll order something brought and we can eat and speak. There's much you need to know, he said, and saw her worried frown. It turned out he was far hungrier than he had thought, and he ate ravenously, gaining a giggle from his wife in the process. He wasn't the only one that was hungry, though, and Ilya woke just after they'd finished, and then Ghost looked to him as well. So Jay opened the door to let the wolf run and hunt. Only the indigo dragon seemed to have no appetite, and that she rested while Ilya had cried for her own meal was something he was glad about. Once fed, Ilya was soon back asleep, and he led Margaery back over to the couch. For Ilya, he said, as he took out the small ruby and handed it to his wife. Is it like our own? Margaery asked. It will be. It was Shireen's, but what happened in Crowan has cured her for true, and so she needs it. Not. I'll ask Sharia to work on it, and Ilya will wear it from now on, he said, and Margaery nodded. How did things go, Jay? She asked, and he decided to tell her about Lady Shella before speaking on the war, and what he now needed to do. She would have been happy at the end, Jake. You did right by her. Marguerite said after he was finished speaking. I wish I'd known earlier and that she'd had the chance to spend her final days in a fully rebuilt Harrenhal, he said, and Marguerite told him once again that Lady Shella would have been happy with all he had done. It's soon, isn't it? She asked, a few moments later. Aye, it is. A moon at most before I need to leave, and others will be leaving far sooner than that, he said, and he took her into his arms, and held her tightly to his chest. What plans have you to make? She asked, as she looked into his eyes. Some are already done. The men I need will be brought to the wall, and there we'll make our stand. Others are contingencies and things that I hope never come to pass, and some are just, saying goodbyes, he said, and felt her shudder and grip him more tightly. I believe I'll win, Marge. Truly I do. I am not afraid of losing or that I'll not see you and our family again. That's not the fear that I feel, he said as she relaxed somewhat. What is? That I'll lose people I love and that I care about. That those I care about will lose people that mean everything to them. I want to tell them all to stay here, to keep them all away from the battle, so I know they're safe, and I cannot, and I fear that I'll return without them. How can I face Ilaria if Oberyn falls, Aerion if Tyrion, or Dany if it's Orolan? I worry about my uncles and how Sansa would react if the North suffers losses, and though I believe I'll win, it'd be lying if I say that thoughts of not seeing those I love survive don't make me fearful. I fear I'll leave things unsaid, as my father did, he said, as his wife held him tight. Make your peace, do all you must, but make your peace before you leave. Jetty. Marguerite said, and he nodded and resolved to do as she bid. Thorn 300 AC. Tyrion, his good mother, doted over both her children, and was even keener than he to see her grandchild born. It was something that he took great comfort in, as he looked at the Raven scroll and read the words that it said, once more. It would be hard enough for him to leave Dorne and do what he must as it was, were it not for Ilario being here to comfort his wife, and see her through a birth that he now was certain he'd not see. He doubted he could endure it. Tyrion had gone over the words he'd say to Aerion more times than he could remember. For 2 days he'd kept the contents of the scroll secret from her, almost as if he felt that by not speaking the words aloud it would make them not true. It was a silly, stupid thought, and it was only that Jay had actually given him far more notice than Dorne itself would get. Was he able to do so, had it came with the orders for Dorne's spears to be made ready, and with Oberyn's return to take them to the wall, then he'd have had no choice but to speak up by now. He took comfort in the fact that his reluctance to speak the words aloud wasn't purely selfish. His wife was feeling the effects of her pregnancy, and at times her mood swung because of it. Aerion could get overly angry, sad, or even happy because of the changes she was going through, and so he feared her reaction to his news. True, there was some selfishness there too, as he wished for things to remain as normal as they could be with them, before he had to tell her news that would cause her such upset. It was times like this that he wished he was a larger man, he thought with a smirk. His brother and Jay both sought the sparring yard to ease their worried minds, and for Tyrion that wasn't truly an option. Though he had learned to defend himself and could wield his axe when needed. Cheer up, you miserable fucker, he heard the voice say, and he didn't need to look up from his desk to know who it was who spoke. Who let you in? He asked, as Bronn took a seat in front of him, and poured himself a glass of wine. Who's going to fucking stop me? Bronn asked, which at least brought a smile to his face. He found his eyes drawn to the note and his thoughts back on his wife. His expression, along with his silence, soon brought him a questioning look from Bronn. Read, he said after a few moments, as he handed Bronn the scroll. So, you've to go to King's Landing on Ligeron. It'll take you, what, a day or more? Bronn asked. It's not that I've to go, it's what it means that I have to, he said, and Bronn looked at him confusedly. Pouring himself a glass of wine, Tyrion began to tell Bronn the full extent of what they were ready to face. He told him of Hardhome, and of what both Oberyn and Loras had told him they'd seen there. Then he explained what it was that had truly been taking place on Dragonstone. How throughout the realm in secret, men had been preparing for the upcoming war, and how the dragons were to be a key part of it. The armor for Lygaron and Rhaenix, that's what the armor was for. Bronn asked, and Tyrion nodded as Bronn swallowed his wine in one gulp, and then poured himself another glass. It is. This won't be as easy as the war to take the throne. This enemy won't be so easily subdued, and so I'll not ask you to join me, he said, as he looked at the man who'd been by his side for a number of years now. A man he thought of as much as a friend as he did a sworn shield or enforcer. Good, Because dead men marching is where I draw the fucking line, Bronn said, with a chuckle, which Tyrion joined in with. It's as good a place as any, he said softly. I'd ask a favor of you, though, he added, a moment later. I'm not sucking your cock, Bronn said far too seriously, and then both of them as one burst out laughing. Why the fuck would you say that, he asked, a few moments later, his own wine glass in his hand as he looked at him. A man needs limits, Bronn said, smirking at him before his expression changed. I'll guard her with my life, Tyrion, and you know how much I value that. I do. Thank you for all of it, he said, and he heard the emotion in his voice. I was well paid, Bronn said with a shrug, and this time it was Tyrion who smirked. Well, don't fucking say it, Bronn said, and Tyrion gratefully welcomed the laughter this time. Later that day, he knew the time had come, and so he made his way to where his wife, her mother, and brother were. Seeing Aerion smile at him, both warmed his heart, and made him feel terrible at the same time. As he took a seat beside her, he found he couldn't speak the words, and so, once again, he stayed silent. Tyrion, spending the rest of the day listening as Trystane spoke of wanting to visit King's Landing, and Malario told him that he could not. At dinner, he barely ate, and when he and Arianne retired, it was his wife that brought it up. Tyrion, knowing then, he had no other choice but to speak words that would cause her some pain, and he only hoped it would not be too much. The raven I received from Jay, it was more important than I may have let on, he said as he helped Arianne undress. I expected as much. What does he ask of you? Arianne asked. The war for the dawn is almost upon us, and it's a war that Rhaegar and I must play our parts in, he said, feeling her stiffen. When, she asked, her lip quivering, and he felt his heart still as he looked at her. I must leave in the next few days, as soon as I'm able. He wishes to speak to us all, in King's Landing, to talk us through with it as we'll face and what our roles will be. Oberyn should be returning to Dorne not long after I depart to gather the army, and bring them to the wall, Tyrion said, and he shuddered, when she brushed past him and sat down on the bed, her tears falling, and he knew he was powerless to stop them. You'll miss the babe being born, Arianne said after a few moments. I believe so, though I'm sure Jay will allow me to use the glass candles to see it once it is, he said, moving to sit beside her on the bed. And if I ask you not to go, she asked softly, then for once, I'd have to go against my wife's wishes. My whole family will be part of this fight. People I care about and would see safe will risk their lives, and I'll not allow them to do so without me, and Rhaegar offering them what protection we can, he said, and though she didn't answer him in words, he found her answer to be even more comforting. He held her in his arms as they lay in bed, both of them having worn themselves out in their bringing of pleasure to each other. Now his fingers brushed through her hair, and his arm held her tightly to him as she slept. She had asked him, and he'd promised he would return. Tyrion promising her that he'd take no more risks than was absolutely needed, and though he didn't feel she took full comfort in what he'd said, he did feel she took some. It was the same the night after, and though he wished he could stay even longer, he knew he could not, and so he spent an entire day saying his goodbyes and making sure that he left nothing unsaid. He wrote a letter that he gave to Satin, the boy almost demanding that he come with him, and Tyrion denying him. Far better he was here than there, and the wall was no place for a lad such as he. There was an argument when Trystane demanded almost that he go to King's Landing with him, and he was surprised when Arianne went against her mother on that. He needs to see the Red Keep and speak to his cousins. Far better he does so with Tyrion by his side and then returns, than waits much longer. Arianne said, and Tyrion felt that it was partly that she feared not all of them would return from the war, that they would soon be headed too. Finally, the time came, and he gathered his things, and called Rhaegar to him, while Trystane waited near where the dragon would land. The thoughts his good brother had of flying to King's Landing were ones that he hoped the reality of lived up to. He stood with his wife and found that for once in his life that his words had had him. There was nothing he could say, and so he kissed her as deeply as he could and prayed it would not be the last time he did so. Come back to me, my lion. Come back to us, she whispered softly in his ear, as he nodded and said he would. He moved to the dragon and didn't look back, afraid that if he did so, then he'd not be able to leave, and so when the hand touched his shoulder it caught him by surprise. Ephyre, he said, turning only to see Bronn standing there. Do I look like your wife? Bronn said, shaking his head. Very much not, you ugly fucker. What are you doing? He asked as he saw the sack he carried over his shoulder. I've guarded your back for too long to let some dead fucker end you. Now tell the prince to move his fucking arse. Bronn said as he moved to Legaron, and Tyrion found himself smiling a few moments later when they took to the air. King's Landing 300 AC. Oberyn, even were he not to know how his nephew felt, it would still be clear to him. Oberyn, seeing just how much Ga was struggling with the thoughts of what he was leading them to. They'd had a dinner where it was just he, Ilaria, and the girls with Jay, Margaery, and Aaliyah, and he knew it was one of many dinners that Jay had, or would be holding. During it, his nephew gave each of them as much time as he could as he laughed with his cousins, spoke to Ilaria and himself, and when it was over, he was reluctant to let them leave. Ilaria too commented about it when they were alone in their room that night, and while just like him she had enjoyed the night, it had become clear to her that there was far more going on than just a family dinner. Over the next few days, Oberyn fought with himself about whether or not to bring it up with Jay or not. On one hand, he felt he should, while on the other, it was obvious just how hard a time Jay was having dealing with the things he was. So instead, it was to Arthur he'd gone to, and he'd found his suspicions confirmed. The war was almost upon them, and Jay was reaching the time not just when he would have to leave and lead them in that war, but he'd have to order them to leave and make ready. He and his nephew had already discussed what would need to be done many moons earlier. Jay had asked him to begin preparing men from Dorne to face what it was they needed to face, and Oberyn had sent word to those he would bring with him. Only half, his nephew had asked for, and so Oberyn had done just that. The strangest thing he had found once he knew for certain what it was that was on Jay's mind was that he felt no reservations about what it was he must do. So he resolved to speak to his nephew and put his mind at ease about that, at least. Oberyn arranging to do so in the one place he knew that Jay would speak most freely. And so he twirled his spear as he waited for him to arrive, and he didn't have long to wait, as it turned out. "You're slow this morning," he said as he ducked away from Blackfire. "Or maybe you're faster, and know my moves better." Jay replied as he spun and almost caught the shaft of his spear. "True, I do feel faster," he said with a chuckle. As he barely blocked the strike, Jay aimed his way. On and on the spar went, Oberyn keeping up in a fight that he should have lost by now, and he knew that Jay was dragging it out. He welcomed that. It was what his nephew seemed to be doing with everything he did. The day before, he'd watched from the balcony as Jay had sparred and played with his 4 youngest daughters. He had been lost to the world, oblivious to everything else around him, other than Elia, Ulbella Doria, and Loreza. Even when they'd finished their games, for that's what they truly were, Jay had sat and spoken to each of them. He'd then had treats brought out for them, and it was only hours later that he'd walked back to his rooms. His girls weren't the only ones that Jay spent so much time with. Jaime's children, Joy, his 2 squires, and of course his own daughter, as well as Obara and Tyen. He'd even heard that he, Margaery, and Ilya were to visit Sarah and the girls she taught sometime over the next few days. The sigh he heard from his nephew when the spar finally ran its course, and his spear was knocked from his hands, was a loud one. While the less said about the expression on his face as he looked at it as it lay on the ground, the better. Jay almost seemed an inch away from crying, so sad did he look at that precise moment. Oberyn watched as his nephew walked over to the water jug and poured them both a mug, and after he picked up and laid his spear against the wall, he joined him. "You know," Jay said as they sat there. "I know. You wear your heart on your sleeve, nephew. How you feel about someone has always been clear to those who know you well. When you're happy or hurting, or when something is bothering you, you do not hide it well," he said before taking a swallow of the water. "A bad mummer," G said with a snort. "A good thing," he replied, as Jay looked at him. "Far too many people wear false faces. Far better that you are not one of them. And besides, it's only with those who know the truth of what's in your heart," he said. And Jay looked at him, a small smile on his face, as he did so. "I want to wish it all away. To just close my eyes and make it not so. And knowing I cannot, that I must not. It's at times more than I can bear." Jay said, his voice sounding broken. "No man has had to bear so much, and there is none that I both wish did not need to, and am happy it's they who do, in equal measure. Were it someone else, then I fear it would break them." Oberyn said, looking at his nephew. "I fear it may," Jay said, "which is why it will not. You are not alone in this, nephew, though it may feel it some time, and knowing you as I do, though you may wish it so," he said, and saw the slight nod of Jay's head. "I will leave by week's end, and after gathering my men then we will sail north. I do not wish to send me, and more like me, yet on this, I'll give you no choice. I go because Dorne needs me to lead its men against the dead. All who faced them before must do so again, so that there is no doubt or question about what they can do and how they must be fought. You do not send me. Ja, I go regardless, he said, and he saw the way Ja relaxed just a little. The girls? Jay asked, and Oberyn shook his head. Stay though, Abara will hate me for it. Their sisters and mother will need them, as will their cousins, he said. And Jay smiled, knowing he included Marjorie and Elia in that. I'll arrange for Aemon or Shira to take you. It'll be quicker that way and give you some more time with our family, she said, bringing a smile to Oberyn's face. Uncle Jay said as he rose to his feet, and Oberyn embraced him. As do I. It's been the boon of my life to have found you and my niece. I am most grateful to have been given back a piece of my sister in the shape of her son. Should the worst come to pass, then know that I'd not have had it any other way. But fear not about your uncle, and remember the only thing we say to death is not today. Jay finished for him and Oberyn nodded. That night he had a private dinner with his girls, and Elaria, Sarala, and Tyen both joining them. And other than Neem, they were all with him. He told them what was to come, and that he'd be leaving in a couple of days, and arranged to spend the next day with them, and them alone. As expected, Obara argued, and only that he told her that she must protect their family, or it would have developed into a far truer argument than it did. Ilaria and he spent the night together in their bed, both of them taking their comfort in each other, and Oberyn felt like a starving man who was unable to sate his hunger. They had a picnic in the Kingswood the next day, just Ilaria, he and their girls, and when they returned to the Red Keep it was to find that Aemon would be ready for him the next day. So after another dinner with his girls and one more night spent in his love's arms, he woke and dressed, and made his way to Jay and Marguerite's chambers. It was no surprise to find Jay awake. His nephew rose early, and went to bed even later than he, as he tried to fit in every hour he possibly could with those he loved. Marguerite still rested, and so it was just Jay and Ilya that he got to spend some time with. Oberyn holding his grandniece in his arms and finding that despite her Targaryen looks, it was his sister he saw in her. He was ready to leave when Marguerite awoke, and he said his farewells to her and to his grandniece. There was no need to say them to Jay, as he would see him again at the wall. Then he made his way to the dragon pit, alone, as he'd said his goodbyes to his family already. Soon enough he was on Sandorix's back, and as they flew, it was with a smile on his face. Rhaenys had joined them as soon as they took to the air, and she flew by their side for the rest of the day. Oberyn finding his eyes drawn to her, and each time he looked at her, her own they were staring back at him. They landed just south of Mistwood, and as Aemon set up the fire, Oberyn talked to Rhaenys and felt her own worries and tried to soothe them, just as he had with Jay. When he woke the next morning, she was gone, and by midday, he was flying over Dornish sands. He had more family to say his goodbyes to, his niece, nephew, and his daughter, and he prayed the goodbyes would not be final.